In a small village, far from the bustling cities, lived a young girl named Abena. She was only 2 years old when her life changed forever. Abena's parents, who loved her dearly, died in a terrible accident. No one could have predicted such a tragedy. The village was quiet and peaceful, and accidents like this were rare. But one day, while her parents were returning from a trip, their cart slipped off the narrow, rocky road, and both of them lost their lives. Little Abena was left all alone in the world. The villagers were heartbroken for the little girl. She was too young to understand what had happened. Her bright eyes would still look for her parents, expecting them to return and hold her in their arms. But they never did. She didn't know that they were gone forever. It was a sad time, and everyone in the village felt sorry for her. Among the villagers was an old woman, Abena's grandmother. She was already old and tired, her hair grey, and her back bent from years of hard work. But when she saw that her granddaughter had no one left in the world, she knew what she had to do. Even though she was poor and had very little, she decided to take care of Abena. This grandmother, though fragile, had a strong spirit. She was determined to give Abena a good life, no matter how hard it would be. Abena's grandmother had no wealth. She lived in a small, run-down house with only a few old belongings. She didn't have any steady job, but she managed to make a little money by doing odd jobs for the other villagers. Sometimes, she would fetch water from the river for people who needed it. The river was far from the village, and carrying heavy pots of water was hard work, especially for someone her age. But she did it anyway. Other times, she would wash clothes for her neighbors, scrubbing them by hand in the cold river water, just to earn a few coins. Despite the hard work and the little money she made, Abena's grandmother never complained. She always put Abena first. If there was only enough food for one person, she would give it to Abena. The grandmother often went to bed hungry, her stomach growling, but she didn't care. All that mattered to her was that her granddaughter was fed and happy. She would smile at Abena as she ate, pretending that she wasn't hungry herself. It was a tough life, but the love she had for Abena made it all worth it. As Abena grew older, she started to notice the sacrifices her grandmother was making for her. She saw how hard her grandmother worked, even when she was tired and her body ached. But no matter how difficult things were, her grandmother never let Abena feel the full weight of their poverty. She made sure Abena was happy, clothed, and fed. And most importantly, she made sure Abena felt loved. The villagers often praised the grandmother for her kindness and strength. They knew how hard life was for her, and they admired how she never gave up. Some would help her when they could, offering small gifts of food or clothing for Abena. But it was never enough to make their lives comfortable. They lived day by day, always struggling, but always managing to survive. Despite their hardships, Abena had a happy childhood. She loved her grandmother deeply and was grateful for everything she did. They spent their days together, walking through the village, tending to their little garden, and fetching water from the river. The grandmother would tell Abena stories from her own childhood, stories of the village when she was young, and the many things she had seen in her long life. These stories fascinated Abena and helped her forget, even if only for a moment, about the hard life they were living. But the older Abena got, the more she realized how different her life was from the other children in the village. Many of her friends had parents who could buy them nice things, new clothes, shoes, or toys. Abena didn't have those luxuries. Her clothes were old and worn, often patched up by her grandmother's hands. She never had new shoes and had to make do with whatever was available. Sometimes, the other children would make fun of her for her old clothes and simple life, but Abena never let it bother her. She knew that her grandmother loved her and was doing everything she could to take care of her, and that was more important than anything. Even though she lived a hard life, Abena always remained kind and humble. She learned from her grandmother that love and kindness were worth more than money or fine things. And though she had very little, she always shared what she had with others. If a friend needed something, Abena would offer whatever little she could. She had learned from her grandmother the value of giving, even when you have almost nothing yourself. Life went on like this for many years. Abena grew older, and her bond with her grandmother grew stronger. The two were inseparable, facing every challenge together. The love between them was unbreakable. But deep down, Abena's grandmother worried about the future. She knew she wouldn't live forever. She worried about what would happen to Abena when she was gone. But for now, she pushed those thoughts aside. She focused on the present, doing everything she could to give Abena the best life possible. The village, though peaceful, was a small place. There weren't many opportunities for people to improve their lives. Abena's grandmother wanted more for her granddaughter. She didn't want Abena to be stuck in the village, struggling as she had. The grandmother dreamed of a better future for Abena, one where she could live a life of ease and happiness. But achieving that dream would be difficult. Still, Abena's grandmother was determined. She would find a way to give Abena a better life, no matter what it took. And so, the old woman continued to work hard every day, pushing her aging body to its limits, all for the sake of the granddaughter she loved so dearly. She knew that one day, something would change, and Abena's life would improve. Until then, she would keep doing everything she could to protect and care for her. As the years passed, Abena's grandmother continued to push herself to the limit, doing whatever she could to provide for her granddaughter. The village was small, and work was hard to find, but she never gave up. Every morning, she would rise early before the sun, her bones aching from age, yet determined to start another long day of labor. Her love for Abena was the force that kept her going. One of the most difficult tasks the grandmother took on was fetching water from the river. The river was a long walk from the village, and the journey was tiring even for younger, stronger people. But for a woman of her age, it was almost unbearable. The path to the river was rough, filled with stones and uneven ground. Each step felt heavy, but she pressed on, carrying large, heavy pots to fill with water. Once she arrived at the river, she would spend time filling up her pots with water, dipping them into the cool, flowing stream. The river was beautiful, but there was no time to rest or enjoy the scenery. She had to get the water back to the village quickly to complete the job and earn a few coins. After filling the pots, the real struggle began, carrying the heavy load back to the village. With each step, the pots seemed to grow heavier. The straps digging into her shoulders left marks on her skin, and her legs felt like they could give out at any moment. But the grandmother never complained. She focused on Abena, imagining her smiling face when she would return home. That thought gave her the strength to keep going. No matter how hard the journey was, she knew she had to do it for Abena. In the village, people relied on her to bring water because not everyone had the time or strength to fetch it themselves. Though they appreciated her work, they could only pay her small amounts, and it was never enough to make life comfortable. But the grandmother accepted whatever payment they could offer, a few coins here, a small bag of grains there, anything to keep food on the table for her and Abena. When she wasn't fetching water, the grandmother would take on other jobs. She would go from house to house, offering to wash clothes for the villagers. Washing clothes was another difficult task. The clothes had to be taken to the river, where they would be scrubbed by hand. The grandmother's hands were old and wrinkled, her fingers stiff from years of hard work, but she continued to scrub the clothes until they were clean. The cold water from the river made her hands ache even more, but she didn't let the pain stop her. After washing the clothes, she would hang them to dry under the sun. While waiting, she would sit quietly by the river, sometimes thinking about her life, but mostly thinking about Abena's future. She often wondered if there was a better way for them to live, but the only thing she knew was hard work. She had no special skills, no education, and no connections. All she had was her determination and her love for her granddaughter. Each evening, after a long day of work, the grandmother would return home exhausted. Her body was worn down, but she always managed to put on a smile for Abena. They would sit together in their small house, eating whatever simple meal the grandmother could afford that day. Many times, it was just a small bowl of porridge or a few pieces of bread. But no matter how little they had, they always shared it. On days when money was especially tight, there wasn't enough food for both of them. On those days, the grandmother would pretend she wasn't hungry, pushing her share of food towards Abena. "Eat, my dear," she would say with a smile. "I'm not that hungry today." Abena, young and trusting, believed her grandmother's words and would eat the food. But the truth was, the grandmother's stomach was empty, and hunger gnawed at her. Still, she never let Abena know. The thought of her granddaughter going hungry was unbearable to her. Though life was hard, Abena remained unaware of the full extent of her grandmother's struggles. She knew they were poor, but her grandmother's love made her feel safe and cared for. She never realized how much her grandmother sacrificed for her every single day. The grandmother was careful to hide her pain, her hunger, and her exhaustion from Abena. She wanted Abena to have a carefree childhood, even if it meant suffering in silence herself. The villagers often spoke of the grandmother's strength and dedication. They admired how hard she worked despite her age and the challenges she faced. Some of them would help out from time to time, offering small gifts of food or old clothes for Abena. But even with this help, their life remained a constant struggle. The grandmother was too proud to ask for more, even though she desperately needed it. As the years passed, the grandmother's health began to decline. Her body, once strong enough to handle the heavy loads and hard labor, was beginning to weaken. Her back was more hunched than before, and her steps were slower. She would often find herself out of breath after carrying the water or washing clothes. There were days when she woke up in the morning and felt like she couldn't get out of bed. But each time, she would push herself to keep going. Abena noticed her grandmother's growing weakness. She saw how her grandmother's hands would tremble as she worked, how her face looked more tired each day. Abena began to worry, but her grandmother always reassured her, saying, "Don't worry about me, Abena. I'm just getting old, that's all. You focus on your studies and your future." Despite her reassurances, Abena couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. She loved her grandmother dearly, and seeing her struggle like this made her heart ache. Abena wished she could do more to help, but she was still young and had no way of earning money. All she could do was try to help with small tasks around the house, hoping to make her grandmother's life a little easier. The grandmother, however, was not concerned about her own health or comfort. All she cared about was making sure Abena had a chance at a better life. She didn't want Abena to grow up and face the same hardships she had faced. The grandmother often thought about the future, about how she could give Abena more opportunities, even if it meant pushing herself beyond her limits. Though her body was failing her, the grandmother's spirit remained strong. She kept working as hard as she could, day after day, with one goal in mind: to give Abena a better future. She didn't know how she would do it, but she was determined to find a way. And so, Abena's grandmother continued her daily struggle, carrying water, washing clothes, and making whatever small money she could. She never let herself rest, always thinking of Abena and what more she could do for her. Little did she know, a decision she would make in the near future would change both their lives forever. The grandmother's love for Abena was unshakable. She had already sacrificed so much, but in her heart, she knew she would be willing to give even more if it meant Abena would have a chance at a better life. And soon, that chance would come, though it would require an even greater sacrifice than she could have ever imagined. As Abena grew older, her grandmother began to worry more and more about her future. The small village they lived in offered very few opportunities, especially for a young girl like Abena. The villagers were kind, but most of them were poor, and they struggled to provide even for themselves. Education in the village was basic, and beyond a certain age, there were no more schools for children to attend. For Abena, staying in the village meant a life of hard work and struggle, much like her grandmother's life. Abena's grandmother didn't want that for her. She had spent her whole life working tirelessly, scraping together whatever she could to survive, and she didn't want Abena to follow the same path. She knew that Abena was smart, kind, and capable of so much more. Abena deserved a chance to make something of herself, to break free from the cycle of poverty that had trapped them for so long. But the grandmother also knew that the only way for Abena to have that chance was to leave the village and go to the city. The city was a place of opportunity, where people could find jobs, education, and a better life. It was a far-off place, bustling with life and full of new possibilities. The grandmother had never been to the city herself, but she had heard stories from others who had gone there. They spoke of tall buildings, schools where children could learn advanced subjects, and businesses where people could earn good money. The idea of Abena going to the city gave the grandmother hope, but it also filled her with fear. Sending Abena to the city meant that she would no longer have her granddaughter by her side. It meant that she would be alone, living without the one person who gave her life meaning. But the grandmother knew that she couldn't be selfish. She couldn't hold Abena back just because she was afraid of being alone. Abena's future was more important than her own comfort. And so, after many sleepless nights of thinking and worrying, the grandmother made a decision. She would send Abena to the city to continue her education. She would do whatever it took to make sure Abena had a chance at a better life, even if it meant letting her go. The first step was finding a way to enroll Abena in a school in the city. The grandmother didn't have much money, but she had saved a small amount over the years, tucking away coins whenever she could. It wasn't enough to cover all the costs, but it was a start. She also reached out to an old friend who had moved to the city years ago. This friend had a daughter who was attending university there, and the grandmother hoped she could help guide Abena when she arrived. One evening, as they sat together in their small house, the grandmother called Abena over to talk. She sat Abena down and held her hand gently, looking into her eyes. "Abena, my dear," she began, her voice soft but serious. "You are growing up, and it is time for you to start thinking about your future. I have decided that you should go to the city to continue your education. There are schools there that can teach you things we can't learn here in the village. I want you to have a chance at a better life, one that is not filled with the struggles I have faced." Abena was taken by surprise. The city. She had heard stories about it, but the idea of leaving the village, leaving her grandmother, filled her with a mixture of excitement and fear. "But, Grandma, what about you? How will you manage without me?" "I can't leave you here alone," Abena said, her voice filled with concern. The grandmother smiled and patted Abena's hand. "Don't worry about me, child. I have lived a long life, and I have managed on my own before. This is your time now. You need to focus on your future. The city will give you opportunities that you can't find here. And I will be fine. As long as I know you are safe and happy, I will have everything I need." Tears welled up in Abena's eyes. She didn't want to leave her grandmother, but she also knew that her grandmother was right. Life in the village was hard, and if she stayed, she would likely end up working the same kinds of jobs her grandmother had done all her life. The thought of fetching water and washing clothes for a living didn't appeal to her, especially when there was a chance for something better. But still, the idea of leaving her grandmother behind weighed heavily on her heart. "Grandma," Abena said, her voice trembling, "I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know what it will be like in the city. What if I fail? What if I can't handle it?" The grandmother's eyes softened, and she pulled Abena into a warm embrace. "My dear Abena, you are stronger than you know. You have faced many challenges already, and you have overcome them all. The city will be different, yes, but you will find your way. You are smart and capable, and I believe in you. As long as you keep working hard and stay true to yourself, you will succeed." Abena held her grandmother tightly, feeling the warmth and comfort of her embrace. She didn't want to let go, but she knew that her grandmother was right. If she wanted a better future, she had to take this chance. The thought of making her grandmother proud filled her with determination, and she decided, in that moment, that she would go to the city and make the most of the opportunity. Over the next few weeks, the grandmother worked harder than ever. She took on extra jobs, fetching more water and washing more clothes than she had before. Her body ached from the effort, but she didn't care. She needed to save every coin she could to prepare Abena for the journey ahead. She also wrote to her old friend in the city, arranging a place for Abena to stay and helping her get enrolled in a school. It was a difficult process, but the grandmother didn't give up. She knew that this was Abena's only chance at a better life, and she was willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. Finally, the day came for Abena to leave. The entire village gathered to say goodbye to her, wishing her well on her journey. Abena's grandmother stood by her side, holding her hand tightly. As the bus pulled up to take Abena to the city, the grandmother hugged her tightly one last time. "Remember, Abena," she said softly, "no matter what happens, I will always be here for you. Work hard, stay strong, and make the most of this opportunity. I love you, my dear." With tears in her eyes, Abena nodded. "I love you too, Grandma. I promise I'll make you proud." And with that, Abena climbed onto the bus, waving goodbye as it drove away. Her heart was heavy with the thought of leaving her grandmother behind, but she also felt a sense of hope. The city was a place of opportunity, and she was ready to face whatever challenges it would bring. As the bus disappeared over the horizon, the grandmother stood alone, watching until it was out of sight. She wiped a tear from her eye and whispered to herself, "Be safe, my dear Abena. Be safe." With Abena now gone, the grandmother returned to her quiet, empty home. The house felt lonelier than ever, but she didn't let herself dwell on that. Instead, she focused on the fact that Abena was on her way to a better life. The grandmother would continue to work and support her granddaughter from afar, no matter how hard it became. She was determined to give Abena everything she could, even if it meant sacrificing more of herself.
Watch out for part 2. Kindly subscribe, like, comment, and share our videos.